Hi, everyone. To wrap up production and costs section, I want to talk a little bit about scale. Scale has to do with the overall size of your operation. And there are a couple quick stories that I want to share to illustrate this point. The first one is about Akio Morita. He's one of the two founders of the Sony Corporation. And so I want to read to you just a real short excerpt from a book about him called Made in Japan, Akio Morita and Sony. And it's about in the 1950s when Akio Morita came to New York City to try to sell transistor radios to department stores. So he was talking to the buyers at a couple big department stores, or at least one big department store. And transistor radios were radios that used transistor technology, which was developed in the US by Bell Labs, but was much smaller than the vacuum tubes that they replaced. So if you've ever seen pictures of old radios that were in big wooden cabinets and they were, quite large, it was like a piece of furniture, like old TVs used to be. That's because of the technology that went inside the vacuum tubes. So Morita came up with these small transistor radios, so they were the size of a shoebox or smaller, which still seems big to us now, but was a huge breakthrough. So he was offering to sell the department store chain 5,000 radios at a price of $29.95. If the chain wanted more than 5,000 radios, the price would change. As Morita described it years later, I sat down and drew a curve that looked something like a lopsided letter U. The price for 5,000 would be our regular price. That would be the beginning of the curve. For 10,000, there'd be a discount, and that was the bottom of the curve. For 30,000, the price would begin to climb. For 50,000, the price per unit would be higher than for 5,000. And for 100,000 units, the price per unit would have to be much higher than for the first 5,000. So what is Morita talking about? Doesn't he know that you should get a volume discount? The more you buy, the lower the price should be? Maybe that's what we're used to or what we think of. But I think that in the short term, Morita had a really good sense of his cost structure, because that lopsided U that he's describing, that went probably something like this. I think that what he's describing is based largely on his average total cost curve. And if they're if they have to produce so many, because if a department store orders some, when are they going to want them? Are they going to want them in 3 or 4 years? No, they probably want them in a few months or 6 months. And so that's the short term, right? Sony can't double or triple their manufacturing space, in a matter of months, right? They have to find space. You have to equip it with all of the capital, all the machinery that you need. You need to hire and train workers. So it's not as simple as just offering a huge number at a lower cost. I think what Morita is describing is prices that he thinks he can sell them for based on the cost of producing those different quantities. Now, that's the short run, right? That's a short run average total cost curve. So the Akio Morita story, that has to do with the short run. But what about the long run? What about when you can choose the whole size of your operation? In the long run, when all inputs are variable, that gets us to this concept of scale. Now, as your operation gets bigger, we usually think about the costs going down, right? That there are economies of scale, that you get bigger and you see the price go down. That is true to a point, but is that always true? That's the question. So for this, I have a picture there of the River Rouge plant. This is a particular plant that Ford built in, let me find the year here. I may have lost the year. 1903. Well, when Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company in 1903, he used the whole assembly line, right, and specialization to drive the cost of producing cars way down. And so he kept getting bigger and seeing that there are efficiencies from that and seeing a lower cost. So he kept building bigger and bigger factories. And so eventually they built a factory in Dearborn, Michigan, and it was along the River Rouge, and so it was known as the River Rouge plant. This is how big it is. This is from a biography of Ford, and the authors describe it this way. A total of 93 separate structures stood on the River Rouge site. Railroad tracks covered 93 miles, conveyors 27 miles. About 75,000 men worked in the great plant. A force of 5,000 did nothing but keep it clean, wearing out 5,000 mops and 3,000 brooms a month, and using 86 tons of soap on the floors, walls, and 330 acres of windows. The Rouge was an industrial city, immense, concentrated, packed with power. By its very massiveness and complexity, it denied men at the top contact with and understanding of those beneath, and gave those beneath a sense of being lost in inexorable immensity and power. Separately, beginning in 1927, Ford produced the Model A, its only car model at the time, at the River Rouge plant. Ford failed to achieve the economies of scale and actually lost money on each of the 4 Model A body styles. Ford could not raise the price of the Model A to make it profitable because at a higher price the car could not compete with similar models that were now being produced by competitors like General Motors and Chrysler. He eventually reduced the cost of making the Model A by constructing smaller factories spread out across the country. These smaller factories produced the Model A at a lower average total cost than was possible at the River Rouge plant. So that takes us to the concept of scale. And we mentioned in that little excerpt there the kind of economies of scale. And we'll see what that looks like on a graph here. But then there's also a concept of diseconomies of scale. Because what happened with the River Rouge example was they made the plant so big that it was actually more expensive than if the plants were smaller. So here we're going to have quantity, right? This is the output level, and then these are costs. And what we'll see is that there are a lot of possible short-run average total cost curves. So if we think about that example that we discussed a while back about making sandwiches, if you were going to make sandwiches in your home kitchen, you could produce sandwiches, right? And you could achieve certain, like by adding more workers in the short run, you could probably lower your costs for a while, and then eventually they'd go back up. So maybe you have a short run average total cost curve that looks like this. Short run average total cost curve 1. Now, you could move to a bigger facility. What if you were going to sell a lot of sandwiches and you're like, well, I just can't produce that many in my home kitchen. It gets too expensive because we get in each other's way. So you rent a, a really small commercial kitchen. Maybe it's a church basement kitchen, right? So you rent a church basement kitchen. Lots of counter space, a couple different refrigerators. And so there you can crank out more. Now, that costs you more. The fixed cost for leasing that or renting that is higher than using your home kitchen. So if you only produce a handful of sandwiches, right, your costs are going to be higher. But if you produce a larger quantity, right, then that drives your costs down. So here's short run average total cost curve 2. And so this is for a bigger plant. Okay? This is for, so if this is your, just as an example, if this is your home kitchen, and this is the church basement kitchen, then what if you want to get even bigger and produce even more? Or maybe you could try to lease the dining hall here on campus. You want something like Ward Haffey, which is that facility is probably bigger than the average church basement kitchen. But if you're only producing a small number of sandwiches, right, then the average total cost is going to be really big. But if you produce a lot of sandwiches, you can drive the cost down even lower. So, right, because you can get a lot of efficiencies out of an operation that big. So we'll call this one Ward Haffey. And then what if you get something even bigger? What if you rent an enormous warehouse? Then, to produce a handful of sandwiches, the cost would be really high. But maybe you can drive the cost down. But maybe if it's really, really big, maybe you can't ever achieve the cost, the efficiencies that you could, in the Ward Haffey one. Right? So we'll call this the warehouse kitchen. And so this is meant to be akin to the River Rouge plant, right? The River Rouge plant was so big Right? It was an enormous facility, but they were never able to drive the cost of producing the Model A down as low as they could at factories that were, somewhat smaller. Now, I just drew in 4, right? There are other potential. Let me just pick a different color here because I'm gonna erase these then too. But there are plant sizes, that are in between these, right? So there might be plant sizes like those that fit in between there. I'm going to take those to see if I can erase just those, so I don't clog it up too much. But the important thing here is if you can choose your scale, if you can choose the whole size of your operation, you'll pick the size that gives you the lowest cost for the level of output that you think you're going to produce at. So, for example, if I think that, let me pick a highlight color here. If I think that my sales are going to be in this range right here, that's the highlighter, it doesn't show up, does it? Let's erase that. If I think that my sales are going to be somewhere in this range right here, well, I could produce them with the church basement kitchen, or I could produce it with the Ward Haffey kitchen, or I could produce it with the warehouse kitchen. But the one that gives me the lowest cost, right, in this case, is the church basement kitchen. So if, on the other hand, if I thought I were going to be producing out in this range out here, then the one that gives me the lowest cost is right here. That's the Ward Haffey size. So let me get rid of a few of these marks. And so the takeaway here is, in the long run, when you can choose the size of your operation, you're going to work off of the bottommost portion of all of the possible short-run average total cost curves. And so the bottommost part of all the short-run average total cost curves gives you a long-run average total cost curve. So the long-run average total cost curve is the bottommost portion of the short-run average total cost curve, at for any given size. For any given output level, any given output range. There might be several different plant sizes that could produce that, which is the one that gives you the lowest cost. And why is this important? Because this is where we can see economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. And so if you're in a range where, as you get larger, as your plants get bigger, you can drive down the cost per unit, you're experiencing what we call economies of scale. That says scale. Let me rewrite that. The L and the C look exactly the same, right? But they're supposed to be different letters. There's the C, there's the L. That time they look different. Economies of scale. So when long-run average total cost curve is falling, you have economies of scale. And in this range over here where it's going up, you have diseconomies of scale. Right, so if you expand your plant size and the long-run average total cost curve is increasing, you have diseconomies of scale. And of course, if it's constant, if you have a range where it's constant, mine doesn't have a very long range where it's flat, but if you do, then you have what we call constant returns to scale. So why is this important? Well, some industries naturally have really, really significant economies of scale. Companies that produce commercial jetliners, there aren't that many of them. Why? Because it takes a huge investment in capital and knowledge, right? You need the engineers, you need think about the equipment and the space you need to build a commercial jetliner. It's huge. So there are huge fixed costs. There are enormous economies of scale, and you don't see a lot of really small companies making commercial jetliners, right? There's a small number of very large firms that make them. There are significant economies of scale there. Something like pizza shops, there are not those huge economies of scale, right? They tend to all be smaller, right? There are economies of scale over for a little while, but pretty soon, pizza can only be transported so far. People have different tastes in pizza. They tend not to be so big. And then, for example, of these constant returns to scale, I think about restaurants. Maybe you don't see a lot of restaurants that just have one or two tables, right? There you can achieve some economies of scale by being bigger than that, but you also don't see a lot of restaurants that have 1,000 tables, right? Can you imagine? I have actually never worked in the restaurant industry. That's one of the basic jobs that I haven't had. I've tried a lot of the others: landscaping, mowing, lifeguarding, all the other stuff you do. But I was never a waiter. However, I've watched enough TV to understand there's an expediter, and how important it is in the kitchen to get all the appetizers for the table out at the same time, and what a challenge that can be. Imagine if you quadrupled the number of tables that you're serving, right? So if you're a restaurant, instead of having, 45 tables, if you had hundreds of tables, expediting and getting everything out to the table at the same time, right at the right time, gets, I think, exponentially harder. And so we don't usually see that. Now, there are convention centers and there are places that do serve a lot of people all at the same time, but those are usually from a very limited menu, right? You maybe when you RSVP'd for the wedding, you had to tell them whether you wanted the chicken or the fish, or the steak. And those are your options. And it's a little different setup. If it is a made to order restaurant, where you can customize stuff and you order from the menu, there may be a range. There may be small restaurants and there may be large restaurants, but you don't see places with 2 or 3 tables, and you don't see places with 1,000 tables. Well, there might be Chinese takeout places that also have a couple tables right in the front, but they're serving a lot more meals than just those 2 tables. So restaurants might be an example where there is a range where you'll see restaurants of different sizes, but all sort of in this range. So at any rate, that's the idea of scale. You have short-run average total cost curves for various plant sizes, and when you put them together and look at the bottommost portion of all of those, you get the long-run average total cost curve. That's where you can identify economies of scale if long-run average total cost curve is falling, or diseconomies of scale if long-run average total cost curve is increasing. And if it's flat, then you're having constant returns to scale. Here are those concepts, right? I already labeled them on the graph, so if you want to pause and look at them, you can. Otherwise, we'll move on. Here is a pretty textbook version of this, of what I tried to draw just a few minutes ago. But economies of scale, constant returns to scale, and diseconomies of scale. This part right here, increasing returns to scale and decreasing returns to scale, that's just another way of saying this. So you can either think about that or not. That doesn't matter. I'm happy with if you think of it as economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. All right, just sort of 2 other things that I want to point out. One is to remind you about the relationship between average total cost and marginal cost, or basically any average measure and marginal measure. So we'll switch to blue so you can see it here. Marginal cost intersects the average total cost curve at its minimum point. Right, remember that, because the marginal measure always drags the average along. When marginal cost is below average total cost, it is falling, and when it is above, it is rising. Right, so that's the pattern, and it actually works the same for average variable cost. We haven't talked a lot about that, but average variable cost, when you draw this in, it's an average measure, so it is also tugged on, right, by the marginal cost, by the marginal measure. So there's that. And then one last distinction is between accounting costs and full or economic costs, and therefore profit. So if we make the distinction in terms of costs, then it will be, you'll understand what that means in terms of profits. So accounting costs, right, what the accountant considers a cost is any out-of-pocket expenditure, right? So out-of-pocket expenditure. You could also think of those as direct costs. So put that up here. The economic understanding of costs is richer, right? It's bigger. It's direct plus indirect costs, right? And so you could think of this as opportunity costs. So, for example, if you rent a storefront for your pizza shop, and every month you have to cut a check or electronically pay the rent, that is an accounting cost, right? That's an economic cost as well, right? Because all the direct costs that's part of the economic cost as well. But the difference is you're adding in the opportunity costs or the indirect costs. But if every month you write a check for the rent for your place, that is a cost. The accountant would consider that a cost. The economist would consider that a cost. If you buy your storefront, but you have a mortgage, and so every month you write a check to the bank, right, to pay the mortgage and taxes and insurance, that is a cost. The accountant would consider that a cost. The economist would consider that a cost. But what if you own the building free and clear? You've been in business a long time, you've paid it off. Or it's been in your family for generations, right? And so you own the building. Now, if you write a check for taxes and insurance, that's an accounting cost, and it would be an economic cost. But what about the value of the store itself? You own it free and clear, so you don't pay rent for the place itself. You don't lease it. You're not paying the bank. You own it. You're not cutting a check. So in the accountant's view, that is not a cost. But for the economist, it is. There's an opportunity cost there. You own that building. That is a resource. That's an asset. And if you don't use it to run your pizza shop, what else could you do with it? Well, you could rent it to someone else to run a pizza shop or a comic book store or a dress shop or medical marijuana or anything else, right? You could rent that to someone else. So every month that you use that storefront for your own business, you are foregoing or giving up the ability to rent it to someone else for money. So whatever you would normally pay in rent, whatever the market value of that storefront is, it costs you that even if you own it and you don't cut a check. So the economic understanding of costs is more broad, right? It's not just out-of-pocket expenditures, it's also opportunity costs. The same thing for your time, the same thing for your resources. So if you take a loan out from the bank, right, and so you pay interest on that loan, that's an out-of-pocket expenditure. If you use your own money, let's say that you had $25,000 in the bank and you used that for startup money to buy equipment for your pizza shop, you don't have to pay interest on that. So you're not writing, out-of-pocket you're not writing checks, you're not having out-of-pocket expenditures to pay it back, but that was your money. And if you did not use it to buy your own equipment, you could have invested that, right? You could have put it in the bank, in a savings account. You could have invested in a money market account. You could have invested in the stock market. You could have lent it to someone else. And so in all of those situations, you would earn interest. So the money that you give up, that's part of the cost of of running your pizza shop. And the same thing for your time. If you work in your shop and you don't take a salary or you draw a very small salary, but if you didn't work in your own pizza shop, you could be off somewhere else working for a salary or for a wage. And so if your opportunity cost is, you used to have a job as an accountant and you made $80,000 a year, and now you stop doing that and you spend all of your time working in your pizza shop, well, your labor is still worth $80,000, right? So that's the opportunity cost of your time. So that's a cost of running your business, even if you don't cut yourself a check, right, for the opportunity cost of your time. Now, why is that important? Because profit is equal to revenue minus costs. But what costs? Which definition of costs? Well, economic profit is revenue minus economic costs. Now, for the accountant, they're just going to look at revenue coming in and then expenditures going out. For the economist, they're going to look at revenue coming in and all of your costs, right? Things you directly spend money on and the opportunity costs of other resources you put into your business, whether that's real estate, whether that's your time, whether that's money that you put up for equipment, if you use your own personal vehicle to deliver pizzas, right? That's a cost. You using your own vehicle doesn't mean that it doesn't cost you something, right, to do that. So that's the difference. So economic profit has a fuller or richer definition of costs. So sometimes you will show an accounting profit, and the economist might say, well, no, you're just breaking even. Right? So you could show an accounting profit for the year of $100,000, but you say, yeah, but what if the opportunity cost of your time is $60,000 and the rent you're giving up on your storefront is $40,000? Then in an economic sense, you're just breaking even. Okay, so that's the difference between accounting profit or economic profit. With economic profit, you use a fuller definition of costs, and so you'll often see that the economic profit calculation is smaller than the accounting profit. Why is that important? Because when we talk about in the chapters where we actually look at various market structures, we're going to think about economic profit. And so you can have an accounting profit that is just an average or normal return on your investment, and that wouldn't count as an accounting profit, or wouldn't count as an economic profit. So if the economist says, yeah, there's an economic profit here, that means there's some return above and beyond a normal return on your investment, more than what you would get by renting out your storefront or selling your labor in the market, or investing your money in the market. So that's what we're talking about. That wraps it up. The last slide I had is just about revenue. You guys all know how to do that, right? If you've ever run a lemonade stand, the number of units that you sell times the price that you sell it for, right? So Q times P, that gives you total revenue. And as you sell one more unit, how much does total revenue change? That's your marginal revenue. That part is all really intuitive. So really just wanted to mostly talk about scale and then costs. So that wraps up this section. Don't hesitate to check in if you have questions. Otherwise, take care.